Welcome to the Dirtbag State of Mind podcast from the Climbing Zine. I am Luke Mihal, and this is one of our Dirtbag classics with Nate Liles. This is a conversation I wanted to reshare for a number of reasons. First off, we're full on in the summer now, and one of my highlights for every summer is going up to International Climbers Festival in July up there in Lander, Wyoming, and I missed it last year because I was at a wedding in Ecuador for my good buddy Keith Brett, but this year I'm going to make it, and I'm excited after hiatus to get back there. And for me, that event it's a great way to see a lot of people, but it's also like this symposium of ideas, and I'm always really inspired by the climbing community up there and then the greater community that gathers and spend some time together up there in Wyoming that second week in July. And the other reason is I love to highlight the work of the American Safe Climbing Association. Nate works part-time with that organization, and actually since we've done this interview, I got to know Nate a bit better and saw how he leads some of the bolting clinics and different things like that. Their work is so important, and it literally does save lives. I think that many people have been aware of the fatality in Kalymnos in Greece by some bolts failing with corrosion from the ocean and being on sea cliffs and stuff like that. But I think the lesson applies to here in the United States, and ASCA primarily operates in the United States. They also do some stuff in Mexico and Potrero, as we talked about. Just highlighting the work of ASCA that really, really does save lives. And re-listening to this, I, was reminded by just Nate's character and how good of a guy he is, and then also the important work that the American Safe Climbing Association does. And they are doing their Lower Off fundraiser coming up next month in July, and it's one of those campaigns where they match a donation for every individual contribution that's made. It's also matched. And ASCA has provided nearly 30,000 lower off anchors. Those are what I call them moosey hooks. Some people call top rope anchors, but they've really made an effort to do that. And I think that's something that, a common accident is the miscommunication between the belayer and the climber while cleaning the anchor, and I think that really fixes a lot of that. And they are also coming up on 90,000 bolts replaced by ASCA, so that's a big deal as well. This conversation really speaks for itself. I hope you all enjoy it. If you want to support this podcast and the Climbing Zine, please subscribe to the Zine. You can also find our clothing and sticker, our Dirtbag State of Mind clothing line and sticker line at the link in our show notes, or just go to shop.climbingzine.com. This episode is brought to you by Patagonia. Patagonia is proud to introduce the Free Wall Kit. 6 pieces to help you rest hard and climb harder on the most sustained multi-pitch objectives. Designed to meet the demands of their ambassadors' evolving tactics for cutting-edge multi-pitch objectives, the Free Wall Kit prioritizes protection and recovery so you can focus on performance. Each piece is built with features to make the most of marginal rest so you can get back just enough energy for the send. Check out the full kit at Patagonia.com. This episode is also sponsored by Kilter. Looking for a fun way to train at home or at the gym? Check out the Kilter board. Kilter board has an innovative light-up holds, a progressive app, and animated functions with climbs for all abilities and multiple layouts to choose from, with large online communities for each. If you've been listening to our podcast for a while, you know that Kilter has been a long-term sponsor, and you can now get a discount on a Kilter board by being a listener. There are flat rate savings. The larger the size, the larger the discount, ranging from $500 to $800 off. Use code ZINE at checkout, and this applies to North American customers only for the full ride, mainline, and auxiliary kits. For more information, check out settercloset.com or look in our show notes. This episode is brought to you by Osprey. Located just down the road from the Climbing Zine headquarters in Cortez, Colorado, Osprey invites you to check out their Transporter series. Rugged, reliable, and designed for all forms of adventure, Transporter travel carry solutions are made to be lightweight without sacrificing durability. Impeccable construction and functional design merge to produce bags capable of navigating both remote mountain ranges and urban environments with ease. Made from NanoTough, a durable, highly water-resistant fabric technology that protects your cargo, leaving no room for compromise. You can find the Transporter series at your local retailer or visit osprey.com. And without further ado, let's get into my conversation with Nate Liles. I'm sitting here with Nate Liles in beautiful City Park here in Lander. Hopefully the mower won't come through here. It is a really beautiful park. I love this place, and you live here. I'm here for the Climbers Festival, and we've been chatting a bunch on a variety of things. Appreciate you sitting down and doing a podcast with us.
Yeah, dude, thanks for having me. It's like to chat with you.
Yeah, and so what is your role with the American Safe Climbing Association?
I'm the development director. So we actually only have 2 employees. I'm half-time, and the executive director is full-time. So we kind of do a lot of different stuff between the 2 of us. But I focus on development and fundraising and just raising awareness.
Yeah, and I feel like you've provided a much-needed aspect to ASCA. I've been working with ASCA for, I think, maybe 13, 14 years, something like that. And it's always been, Greg Barnes was like, you hear about that ASCA will give people bolts, or you see them around, and you're a dirtbag climber, you don't want to pay for your own bolts. So you email Greg, and Greg's asks you all these questions to make sure you're legit, and then he just sends you boxes of stuff. Like, I've literally, been working with him for 13 years, and it's kind of a beautiful thing that the process is so simple like that. But I've always been grateful for ASCA, and I feel like we all try to find ways to give back in our climbing community once we've reached a certain point of, I feel like climbing gives us a lot, and then we want to give back. And for me, it's like the ASCA, just being a volunteer with ASCA is my way to give back. Because it's, like we were talking about the other day, it's hard to be consistent with, joining nonprofits or whatever and being on a board. But ASCA's just made it really easy to give back. And I kind of want to start the conversation down in Mexico, because I've been climbing down in Potrero for almost 20 years, and the place, needs so much care. I think in the Mark Grunin episode, where Potrero needs a lot of love, and ASCA is probably the most prominent American group to really contribute to Potrero by providing bolts. And so I just kind of wanted to start off by just, thanking you all for providing that and kind of branching out beyond stereotypically, it's the American Safe Climbing Association. I'm sure a lot of American groups don't operate down there because their scope is within, advocating for the United States. But it's just amazing that ASCA's been able to do that. Could you talk about that a little bit? Just what the need down there and the decision that ASCA would support the climbers of Potrero and the greater Monterey area?
Yeah, for sure. I think EPC is one of those places that is actually.
Oh, you call it EPC?
Yeah, I mean, either. Yeah.
No, it's it's like EPC or Potrero.
Yeah.
I just first heard EPC recently in the last couple of years. So,
yeah.
Anyways, go ahead.
It's very similar actually to a lot of climbing areas, especially in the West, in the States, where it gets a lot of visitation from American climbers, but the size of the local community and the local climbing community and the resources they have are really limited. So in those situations, I feel like as American climbers, we sort of have this obligation or this responsibility to be good stewards and not just come and use the resource. And, high traffic and high visitation has a big impact on areas, whether we like to admit it or not, and that includes the fixed hardware resource. So our focus, it's pretty clear to be able to support an area like that has also just a bunch of American developers. If you look at the development that's happened, ton of it has been from Americans. Probably the majority of it has been from Americans. So it's logical for us to support replacement work there. We don't subsidize new routing, but supporting maintenance work is totally logical.
In the last episode that aired, we were talking about, there are groups that are doing some work down there, like Escalada Libre, based out of Monterey, and they've started their own bolt replacement. It was cool to see them there at the facelift this last year in Potrero. Yeah.
And we've actually been directly supporting those guys. Some rebolters have worked with them in the past and given them some training, so we have been actually directly supporting them and areas outside of Potrero that see some visitation for American climbers. So those guys are doing great work down there. Shout out to them for sure.
Shout out. And the one thing I love about Potrero, and my buddy Sean and I were talking about this yesterday, is like the world is becoming more of a global community. And in Potrero, you see this, Mexico has, you can't just ship stuff in Mexico or two places. It's like you don't see the UPS truck going down the street ever, and that, the fact that American climbers will then figure out ways, because you can get taxed by the government. I know that some folks brought some ASCA bolts down and kept them in the box, and then they're going to tax you, where when I brought mine, I put mine in the suitcase and they do their little half-ass search, and
yeah, I don't even know if tax is the right word. You might get kind of shaken down a little. And
the Mexico hierarchy status, but it is cool to see that effort. And I was just blown away and by how much has been done. I didn't spend a ton of time there in maybe the last 10 years or so. So seeing a 10-year difference of how much things progressed. And I went down there in December for a couple weeks and I just noticed so many more ASCA bolts. And then it almost got me inspired to do more myself too. And you were talking about that. It's just you see all these good, because even only a bolter will see a good anchor and realize someone did this work, and there's a lot of work to do still in Potrero, for sure.
Yeah, totally. I think it's a momentum thing, and hopefully the people that are psyched to do this work are keeping pace with the increased visitation, because it's certainly getting busier.
Absolutely, yeah. And I just think some of these anchors, they need those Yosemite 3-4 bolt anchors, that you have one party coming down, one party coming up, because some of these anchors are 2 bolts, and we don't need to nerd out on bolts too much, because we did set the intention at the beginning of this episode to really convey this episode to experienced climbers, but also people that want to learn some more about bolting. But I think now's a good time you were telling me about the history of ASCA, and even though I volunteered for so long, I really didn't know a lot of the history. So, the folklore is that Chris McNamara started the group. I guess I'll just let you kind of take the story from here, because Chris McNamara started ASCA I'm guessing some point in the 90s in Yosemite. Is that correct?
In the mid or late 90s, Chris started doing hardware replacement work in Yosemite, and really, I think thinking about the history, first of all, I probably don't have the best details in this, because when it started, I was about 11 or 12 years old, but I think the 2 big names here are Chris McNamara and Greg Barnes. And Chris really had this initial vision, and I think born out of necessity in a way. He was really psyched on walls and spending time on the side of El Cap, right?
I remember when I first started climbing, he was the guy on the cover of the magazines, and they concluded, Climbing Magazine concluded that he had spent a certain percentage of his life on El Cap, because he started climbing it when he was in his teenage years, right? Yeah,
totally. And
so
he was a
wall rat.
Visionary in a lot of ways, right? In both really starting wall climbing early and doing some hard stuff, and then he got into base jumping and actually got out of base jumping, which is that's a different story entirely, I think, for people that are able to be hardcore into that community and actually move out of it successfully. It's just a very dangerous endeavor to spend a lot of your time. But anyways, he started replacing bolts, and a lot of these wall anchors had a ton of bolts, but they're all 1/4-inch button heads and really pretty ugly, and everyone would keep adding another one.
You describe that. So someone comes up to an anchor and they see several 1/4-inch bolts. What do they do?
Yeah, for sure. I think for a lot of people, well, first of all, we're talking about wall anchors here, right? So you've got a lot of gear and you're rigging a bunch of different things on the wall, and it's I think a lot of people are used to a kind of a standard single pitch anchor. It's just 2 bolts, and that's just not the case for a wall anchor, right? Out of necessity, you kind of need a lot more bolts. Mm-hmm. And there was just a massive 1/4-inchers, and people would come up and they would see all these button heads, and they all look kind of bad, and so they would put in another one. At least it was fresh, right? And that just adds to it.
Someone who hasn't seen a 1/4-inch bolt, they're literally like nails, almost like.
Yeah, I think it'd be good to get, for context, unless you spend a lot of time on walls and whatnot nowadays, obscure areas, you actually don't see a lot of 1/4-inch or button heads, but it's a compression bolt. What you're doing is you're drilling this 1/4-inch hole, like think of sort of like roofing nail size, less than an inch long, and hand drilling it. It's pretty quick to drill that way, and all you're doing is just pounding it in the hole, and it's expanding, you're creating friction against the wall and kind of smooshing in there, and that's all it's doing. I mean, when we remove them and replace them, you just take a fork, what we call a tuning fork, like kind of a drilled out piton, and you drive it in behind with a hammer, and you just pop them out, and they pop right out. So certainly not a sustainable long-term solution, and realistically, it's fine if you're hanging off it, but if you're trying to free climb, you really don't want one of those things behind you. Anyways, so Chris starts saying, well, why don't we put proper 3/8 stainless steel bolts in here and remove some of these old button heads, clean up some of these wall anchors, and that just grew. It was kind of obvious that you could try and scale that. So with some help from his dad, Steve, and Armando Menical, actually, who's also the founder of the Access Fund, it kind of helped him file some paperwork to be a 501c3. And he decided the logical path to scale it up would be to have a rebolting clinic and get people into it. And somewhat disappointingly for Chris, he thought maybe 5 or 10 people would show up, and this is not surprising in the climber world, I guess. Everyone's focused on their climbing, but one person showed up, and that one person was Greg Barnes, who is currently still the executive director of the ASCA.
Yeah, that's amazing, and good for Chris too to think of it. And I don't know how much Armando, is that his name?
Yeah.
I'm familiar with him only because of that Climbing Gold episode. Actually, he was such a big contributor to the climbing world that is somewhat unsung, but
very, very unsung. Yeah. His contributions to his forward thinking to conservation of the climbing environment and creating a resource so climbers have a voice is really unsung. Most people don't even know his name.
Yeah, and so Chris also had then the team, the ASCA team at that point, had the vision to sustain the group, which is very difficult with nonprofits, especially climbers. We get a great idea and we work on it for a year or two, or especially if something's non-paid. I think there's the 3-year nonprofit burnout that everyone talks about. But he had the good fortune of hooking up with Greg Barnes, and then Greg Barnes is just this. Can you talk about where it goes from once it gets into Greg's hands? Because we're talking about a long time period before they even hired you. We're talking what I'm guessing 20 plus years, huh?
Yeah, over 20 years. So I mean, I think a lot of this just moved forward through necessity. It was something that was really needed. But Greg is certainly a defining force here. Chris has been involved in the organization, and he's still on our board and is supports the organization in a bunch of different ways. Really incredible to see how much it's scaled up since he started. And I don't think he could have forecasted, where we're at now with over 60,000 bolts replaced with ASCA hardware. It's kind of staggering, actually.
Something else I want to highlight that you had some really interesting information on is when sport climbing started, it wasn't this thing that they could have ever expected it to be today. Could you talk about, and it's a generalization to talk about every sport climber's mindset in the early days of the late 80s, early 90s. But could you talk about the early sport climbing mindset from, some of the bolters you've talked to or just experiences you've had and seen?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you talk to a lot of those early developers, and one common thread you'll find is that they'll tend to say that they really never expected that it was going to get this much traffic, or that it would even get repeated by anyone aside from maybe their friends in their local community, because it was just such a fringe thing. So I don't think anyone could have really forecast the scale. And a lot of time people are very quick to say, oh, why would you use such terrible hardware, and sort of criticize the initial development style. But it is very important to remember that, first of all, they may not have had a ton of resources. Secondly, there was no real best practice or standard for this stuff.
There's no YouTube video from Fixie or ClimbSec or whatever.
No, not at all.
ASCA,
yeah, absolutely. And they really also just didn't think they were kind of doing it for this very small community and for themselves. And I think there's very few people that had this true vision of scale. So it's important to recognize that when we're looking at, well, why did this stuff get used? And a lot of time, I mean, when you're talking about people doing walls, it's a lot of hardware, and really the vision is trying to get up this thing, not thinking about people coming behind. So
right.
I should give, before we move away from the history, I should give Greg an extra shout out here, because his first few years of running the ASCA, he didn't even take any salary at all. I mean, we've always been a very grassroots organization, but he was purely volunteering his time, not just supplying hardware and networking with people, training people, but also replacing bolts. Yeah. He's done a massive amount of bolt replacement, focusing a lot of it on free roots, that had 1/4-inch button heads and stuff like that really, really needed to be addressed because they were legitimately dangerous. Free climbing above 1/4-inch button heads is not a safe endeavor by any means. And a lot of it he did in areas that required hand drilling. So, he probably has personally replaced somewhere around 2,000 bolts, and most of those by hand. And I will also note that all the work we do, actually replacing bolts, is volunteer work. That's outside of our normal ASCA work. We're not insured to have work at height coverage or anything like that. So when we actually go out and do rebolting work, that is volunteer work for us also. So the amount of time Greg has put in and effort is truly staggering. And he won't tell you that himself, but I will give him a shout out here, because it is really pretty staggering, and the climbing community as a whole owes Greg a debt of gratitude for sure.
Yeah, big thanks to Greg. And really the context of the conversation is that bolts are necessary for climbing. There's no really getting around. If you're climbing on a rope at some point, you're going to end up clipping a bolt sooner or later. And the hardware that these routes were originally equipped, like you said, there's no standard operating practices like there basically are now. And so it was just like kind of a ticking time bomb that needed to be addressed. And it seemed like ASCA, even though the issue of dangerous bolts is always something that's going to come up, it seems like you really helped address this need that was there in the climbing world.
Yeah, totally. And it really did come out of necessity. We've always been very grassroots, and the reason we've been able to accomplish all this work is because of volunteers across the country. The volunteer effort that's gone into this is really unbelievable. And, every week we have new folks contacting us that are stewards at their local area that are interested in getting into this work or have been doing this work and have been paying for it out of pocket or trying to raise funds locally. So really our methodology is we're removing this cost burden of placing the best possible hardware when we do replacement work that's going to last the longest. And what that does is it really creates less impact too. When you have a scenario where someone throws in another wedge bolt because the bolt next to it is bad, and then that one turns into a spinner, won't tighten down, 10 or 15 years down the road, and you throw in another one, we're kind of running out of real estate. And I'm speaking in this context mostly to the sport climbing that we tend to support a lot of these days, because there is so much more traffic in this space. And it's important to realize that even really high quality hardware, if it gets enough traffic, it does have a finite lifespan. So we really want to be using the stuff that is going to last the longest, so that when we're thinking down the road, that this resource is going to be around for future climbers, and it's not going to be totally trashed with a bunch of bolts everywhere and just a mess,
Personally, how did you get into all of this stuff? Like, where did you start climbing at? How did your love for climbing transfer into, wanting to get back to replace bolts and everything like that?
So I started climbing in Colorado in probably 2002. And I actually started climbing outside at some of the early sport climbing venues, Shelf Road, Penitente Canyon. And these areas, even just 20 years ago, already had aging hardware It was placed in the 1980s, kind of a variety, a mix of hardware.
Yeah, and that's something we should probably note, that stainless steel hardware, which is generally what you need to use, wasn't a standard then, and also it was not readily available to have the combination of stainless steel bolts and hangers from climbing companies, right? Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, rust was an issue, and corrosion was an issue, and maybe a bigger issue was appropriate hardware for the rock type. So we talk about a place like Shelf Road or a place like Penitente Canyon. It's limestone and volcanic tuff, and wedge bolts just have a pretty short lifespan in that rock. A wedge bolt is really commonly used for development. What you'll typically see is a 3/8, so it's a stud. And as a climber, what you'll see is a threaded stud sticking out of the wall with a nut on it, and hopefully a washer under it that holds the hanger on. And if you loosen the nut, you can pull the hanger right off, and you'll be left with just a threaded stud sticking out of the wall. So that's what most people see is that side of it. And what's going on inside is you have a little clip at the bottom. When the bolt is tightened, it slides that over a cone at the bottom of the bolt, and that creates this wedging action. And it's a very small clip that actually holds it in. So if we're in really hard rock, that's fine. The rock isn't going to deteriorate. But when we're in soft rock, what happens is it creates this cavity back there, and eventually you won't even be able to tighten the bolt back down again when it gets loose, and you'll get this kind of permanent spinner. And when you're in vertical terrain, it can be all right. It's not going to be immediately dangerous or fail right away, but enough hangs, enough falls on it, that bolt will certainly deteriorate and become dangerous.
Yeah, so you're climbing at Penitente, Shelfie.
Yeah, in my first years of climbing, close to my first decade of climbing, like so many people, was very much focused on my own climbing journey. But I did reach a point where I kind of had some thoughts about, who takes care of this? Who's the person that's going to fix this thing when I come across this bolt that scares me? Early on, I was quite a scared climber, maybe intimidated of falling, intimidated of heights. It really took me a lot of time to process past that, and that meant I thought a lot about the fixed hardware.
Yeah.
Is this thing going to fail on me?
You're
Can I hang on this thing?
Bed at night, what's this bolt made of?
Yeah, totally.
Interesting.
And so eventually, maybe a decade or so into my climbing, somewhere around 2010 or 2012 maybe, there was a stewardship day at Penitente. And a big focus was replacing hardware there because there was a lot of old homemade hangers. This is something you see a lot with 1980s, 1990s sport climbing areas. There was very few companies making a good hanger, and they're pretty expensive, the ones that were made. So a lot of people would take bed frame angle iron, and they would actually just think of a right angle slice of iron, and they would actually just chop it up into slices, and then they drill 2 holes in it. One hole was for the bolt, and the other one was for you to clip your carabiner quick draw through. And there's a lot of variety in those. Some of them were pretty darn solid. Other ones were pretty bad. And then the other thing we saw a lot of was welded cold shuts. And the welded cold shut is a pretty obvious solution, right? You get a cold shut from the hardware store, you hammer it shut, you put a weld on it, and you've got this kind of nice ring-style hanger. Problem is, many of those welds were done in someone's garage by people who were not very qualified welders. So what we saw those cold shuts starting to fail. Wow. and unwind. And under a leader fall, you can produce enough force to unwind one of those completely.
All right, so you're down in Penitente, and you signed up. And who organized the clinic? Was it an ASCA clinic, or had the Climbers Coalition down there been started yet?
No, not at all. It was really primarily organized by Bob D'Antonio, who was one of the original developers. And
right. Yeah.
He actually created a ton of the sport climbing resource in Colorado, particularly. Did a ton of work down there. It really had the vision of sport climbing being the future pretty early on, just behind the Smith Rock guys. So he really loves that canyon, and he wanted to see some work get accomplished. And I was kind of at that point in my climbing where my vision was starting to expand a bit. I'd gotten into traditional climbing. I'd kind of gotten past my initial fears and my trepidation around just being exposed.
You learned that a good bolt was really strong.
Yeah, for sure. And I had also, along with that, I had learned that bad bolts are are really pretty dangerous, and a lot of them are kind of ticking time bombs.
Mm-hmm.
So came down for the work weekend. Essentially, it was just a kind of a grassroots effort by locals, people that love the area. Some local climbers showed up, but a lot of folks from out of town. A lot of people love that little area. Mm-hmm. It's kind of a formative place for a lot of people's sport climbing. Mm-hmm. And first time I walked into the canyon, I bumped into Bob, and I started talking to him about hardware and some of his new routing there back in the day. And he was the first person that kind of opened my eyes to this idea that there isn't someone who's kind of designated and responsible to take care of things. Mm-hmm. A lot of the time first ascensionists will come back and do work on their routes, but a lot of them have moved on, have passed away. I mean, there's just not someone who's going to come back and make sure, nor should there really be. No one would be putting up routes if you had ultimate responsibility for that route down the road. So, and what we hear all the time at the cliff is someone will say, well, that bolt's a spinner. Someone should take care of that.
Right, yeah.
And Bob was the first one who was kind of like, well, you're that someone.
Yeah.
You should take care of it. And it grew from there. I learned a good bit about replacing hardware at that first work day. Mm-hmm. And then a couple years later, we had another one. And by that point, I was fully equipped to do the work myself. And I was able to make contact with Greg at the ASCA. He had supplied a bunch of hardware for the previous one, but I was just out there as an independent volunteer. Mm-hmm. And in the decade following that, I have really taken that up as, I lived on the road for a long time in the West, and I spent a lot of time at various areas that saw quite the menagerie of hardware. Old sport climbing areas, areas with a lot of mixed routes, places like City of Rocks, Shelf Road, Penitente, some of these areas that saw pretty early development and really needed the work. They needed someone to pick it up.
Yeah, and Penitente, we were talking off the mic, that's where my love for sport climbing really started, in that place. And very similar to Potrero, I didn't go there for a long time, and the last few years I've been back, I'm like, wow, this place is set up and good to go. There's a lot of, you can tell there's been a lot of bolt replacement, and then there's the Moosey hooks at lower offs that we can talk about later. Another place that I noticed, wow, this has been taken care of, and but that's interesting that Bob D'Antonio really led that force, because I don't think, I knew he was a big route developer, but I don't know if I knew that he had spent so much time on the back end as well. I mean, that's got to be very full circle for him. And then learning that, was it one-on-one from Bob?
Well, we had a collection of people there that were qualified, and a lot of it was kind of shadowing and watching other folks. And a little bit of one-on-one. I have to give a shout-out for the Penitente region. Bob was doing some of that initial stuff, but what he really wanted to see is the local community take up the stewardship work. Mm-hmm. And the San Luis Valley Climbers Alliance, those guys formed after that, a few years down the road. Definitely they got a little push from Bob saying, hey, you guys should own this, but really they were just super motivated, wanted to take care of their resource, wanted to create more community, wanted to create a welcoming environment for all different climbers. And I did a bolt replacement clinic for those guys, showed them how to replace bolts with adhesive anchors, which is what you really want to be using in that softer rock and that volcanic tuff.
So you're talking glue-in bolts?
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
I've done a lot of bolt replacement there, but man, once I showed those guys the deal, they just absolutely ran with it. And if you go to Penitente these days, all the classics are equipped with glue-ins. Everything's got a clip and lower anchor, good trail work. They're really doing excellent work, going hole for hole with almost all the bolts, doing good extraction and really clean replacement work. So a huge shout out to those guys for that work in the region. Yeah,
we've actually been trying to get Angela and Wes on the show for a while. So we'll have to dive into the SL, or they're two of the main members with the San Luis Valley Climbing Association.
Yeah, co-founders there for sure,
yeah,
and they have a great community there now too. There's a bunch of people doing work, but like so many, especially rural areas that have climbing resource, they've really stepped up, to steward this area that gets visitation from a lot of different people. Traveling climbers, people that routinely come from the Front Range, and they've really owned it. And they've really stewarded that resource super well. So deeply appreciative to guys like that and local climbing organizations across the country that are doing that. This work is just not possible without those folks.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to see the breakdown of, as time goes by, it's not just ASCA that, you guys supply the hardware for people, but you really need the climbers coalitions, you need the motivated individuals, and then you need to kind of make it sustainable so it continues over the years. And it seems like a community with a strong local climbers, what we call LCOs in the business, it seems like having an LCO, a local climbing organization, is key to getting the work done over the years, especially, and then ASCA supplies the hardware.
Yes, absolutely. And I think one critical point here to recognize is that American climbing has this fantastic diversity in style. And a lot of it we center around, we use the term ethics, but stylistically, from area to area, what works well in one area is not what works well in another area, whether it be rock type or how routes were put up. And what it really takes is a good consolidation of local community and first ascensionists to know what's appropriate when you do stewardship work in that area. And the same goes for development. If you go to an area that has been very traditionally developed in a ground-up style, and it has this very firm ethic around that, to go in and decide you're going to wrap bolt a bunch of sport routes is probably not an ideal way to develop the resource, right? You have to understand the history. You have to understand the context. There's really room for both of these things in our climbing, both this modern sports style approach and also this, very traditional ground up, that should be preserved in our climbing too. And there's people who seek that out, even if the majority of folks want to go out and clip bolts and have a pretty safe experience. We have so much richness in our variety and our history of climbing, and what it takes is local communities to make sure we're stewarding that in a way that is sustainable, that we're doing really good credence to the folks that had the original vision, and modernizing hardware where appropriate, but also being able to think about this stuff with nuance and have good discussion.
Nuance is the word that is lacking maybe most in our culture in general right now. But
yes.
That when you talk about bolts and there's various things that are going on at the higher levels of government to try to legitimize bolts, because bolts are even amongst our user group, because there was that, I don't know if you read that editorial recently that went kind of viral, or not necessarily went viral, but was syndicated. It was written by a environmental nonprofit that didn't want to see bolts in wilderness. And they used a lot of I wrote an editorial that you can read online in reply to that. But I don't want to necessarily dive into that, but I want to talk about, bolts are nuanced even within climbers, and two climbers won't see the same situation the same way. So, can you talk about some experiences where, you were telling me at one point you replaced the bolts on a route and the first ascensionist had contacted you, and the person, could you talk about that kind of situation and these learning lessons that occur over the way, just based on the nuance of bolts and how some communication can go a long way too?
Sure. Yeah. So I've done a lot of replacement work generally around the West as I travel. It's something that I've felt has been my way to give back to areas that I visit. Instead of just coming and taking from the climbing resource, I try and do some stewardship while I'm there. And areas with older hardware, the logical thing to do is some replacement work and, try and update some of these routes. So I had an experience where I was replacing hardware, kind of an obscure sport climbing area, but fairly, early 90s developed, aging hardware for sure, lots of welded cold shut, stuff like that. And it just was due for an update on a bunch of routes. So I updated one of the classic 510s there, extracted all the old hardware, used the same holes with glue-ins, adhesive anchors. So really long-term solution. The bolts were really where they needed to be. It was bolted with good clipping stances in mind originally. So I didn't really think twice about it. Generally with replacement work, if you're going to make a major change to a route, it's one thing, and that warrants a large consensus and discussion with the first ascensionist. But typically replacing hardware, that's not something we stress about a lot, because really what we're trying to do is just get rid of this stuff that's become dangerous over time, and everyone has been enjoying the route in its state, and we just want to make sure the hardware isn't going to fail. So I didn't really think twice about it, and finished my work on the route, and I got an email from the developer, because I had just made a note on Mountain Project that I had done some work, and they were kind of upset, that I hadn't reached out to them first, and that got me thinking a little more about it. And ultimately, we had a good discussion, and they ended up being pretty happy that the work had been done and thanked me for it. But I think it's important to remember that there's often this sense of ownership for folks that do development work, and First Ascensionists want to be included in the discussion. I think
they put the initial effort into the climb too, whether you like it or not. They put a lot of work into it.
And there's nuance in this discussion too, because there isn't truly ownership there. When we develop a route on public land, it is a community resource, and it exists a bit in this gray area. And your comment about bolts and the validity of placement and all the politics around that right now definitely relates right back to that. But we've existed in this gray area for a very long time, where it's not an overtly sanctioned activity on public land, but it's being tolerated, right? And that's why it's come down to climbers to do this type of maintenance work, because there's no land manager, very few land managers out there who want to touch it. But they also don't want things failing and people getting hurt. That's a huge jeopardy to access. So there is nuance in this discussion. A First Ascensionist has a lot of say, certainly in routes they've done, and especially if those routes were done in a traditional style. And when I say a traditional style, I mean from the ground up. A lot of people nowadays think of, traditional equals gear, but really a traditional route is anything that's done in that I start at the ground and go to the top style. And that might be a route that actually is only protected by bolts, where they climbed up and they drilled it from a stance. So a lot of the time now people say, oh, it's a trad climb, but what they actually mean is it's the gear climb. So there is nuance in that. But, to go up to a route that has been established in that style and try and change that and maybe add extra protection or something like that, we should be really careful and really critical about that, because that's a climbing resource that I think is important. And on the other side of that, when we look at something that's been developed in a rappel bolted fashion as a sport climb, so someone came in from the top and they got to see all the holds, mark everything up, check out the clipping stances, and then lead it. If they created this really run out ground fall experience clipping, it's a very valid discussion within the community to say, okay, is this really how we want this to be for something that was established in this rappel bolted style and is definitely intended to be a sport climb? Should it have a ground fall potential, a death fall potential on it? So there's a lot of nuance in this, and I think the place to start is really how it was established and getting good consensus in your community with this type of stuff. Through the experience I had, just thinking I'm doing a good thing and having someone be pretty upset with me about it. And it was a good reminder to say, okay, make that extra effort maybe to reach out to folks, even if you're just replacing one for one. Because, of course, if we're going to change something or you think something is really inappropriate for the style of the area and should be modified, we all need to come to consensus and have a discussion there. But one-for-one replacement, that was a good lesson for me.
Yeah, and I think that the fact that you talk to the person, I'm assuming you didn't get a big fight on the internet, that's one thing I've really realized has a lot of value, is just talking to someone about something instead of letting it blow up on the internet. Because whenever something like this blows up on the internet, it's never good for climbers' images.
It's not a good look. And I immediately got on the phone with them, and we actually supply them with hardware now to do their own replacement work. So a great relationship was formed, but, fighting on a forum online is just not a good place to get consensus. Get together with your community, have a meaningful discussion, be respectful to each other. We just need more of that in the world.
We do, and it reminds me, because I want to kind of talk about both of our individual communities, because something when we were having our prep for this, I realized is when all your climbing is just bolted sport routes, there's a lot less potential for controversy. One role I've kind of played in our community in Durango, my buddy calls me like the peacemaker, like if there's someone who's upset, I'll try to like talk with both parties, because Durango is that it started off traditional. We have this traditional crag called East Animus, and then we have some sport crags. But like the heart of our climbing is traditional climbing, but the best climbing is bolted. So there's been so many debates over the years and contentious things And only recently we've had a climbers, we've only had a climbers coalition for a couple years, but that's a role that, just that one-on-one communication will diffuse so much.
Such a common thread, I think, through climbing areas in the U.S. is you have this divide that still exists between the initial style and then what has become of this kind of modern development style. Many areas that have that scenario.
Sometimes I've noticed in Durango, if the we just have one person, I'll give him a shout out, Dave Kozak. I don't know him super well, but he's this real old school climber, and he did both. Like, he did everything really brave, and like his name is all on the roots and everything. But when people circle back to him, he's like, yeah, like, fix it up, like, add some bolts. And it's just that certain people and communities will, there's often these prolific route developers, and in certain places only a few. And like someone like David Kozak, he's just always supportive of his routes being equipped modernly, and he still lives there and still climbs on them.
Some folks are just great about that.
Yeah.
And I think the difference is folks that really want to see people enjoy what they've created, and they're less concerned with their ego around their initial experience. And that's not always the motivation for folks. Like I said, stylistically, how the route was done is a very valid discussion, and certain things should be preserved. But Bob D'Antonio, who I mentioned earlier, is very much the same way. A lot of that, he's like, man, we didn't have many bolts, I didn't have much money. I was climbing 513. If I bolted a 511, it was just the bare minimum. Yeah. And a lot of those routes that were rappel bolted, he's come back and said, yeah, let's realign this for a safe experience so people can enjoy this beautiful route. And while that's not appropriate everywhere, and that shouldn't be the case with everything, in certain contexts, that's really valuable. And having the first ascensionist be on board with that and really want to see people enjoy the thing they've created is really cool, I think, and that happens at areas across the country.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely it's really easy when people are like that. I want to talk a bit about Lander because I come up here every year, and this is like my summer camp / symposium or whatever, for the Climbers Festival up here. But I'm always impressed with the climbing community here. But you made me realize maybe it is a little easier because, you're primarily dealing with bolted climbs that you're maintaining, and you don't have any. Maybe there are some trad climbs in this area. I know the Wind River has plenty, but do you think that made it easier for the climbing community in Lander to be so cohesive? Is because it is mostly sport, or do you think it's just kind of a coincidence?
I think in this case we actually do have a fairly large traditional resource. Of course, most people come here as visitors to go sport climbing. I think in the case here, it actually is purely due to the strength of the community and how consolidated it is. Some of the original figures in development here in Lander are still here and still active, and they've had this through line of vision that's been really, really consistent.
And who are some of these people?
So I think the first person I'd mention is Steve Bechtel. Steve and his wife Ellen are really amazing people, and they're at the center of the climbing community here in a lot of ways. They have Elemental, the gym here in town. Steve has authored several guidebooks. He's a climbing training business, coaching business. Has done a ton of development, a ton of rebolting. So he's definitely one of the early developers, developing here in the 90s, who's still here and still doing it at a very high level. There's a bunch of other folks, and I'll probably miss people for sure. But, people like Paul Piana are still around too. Paul doesn't live here, but he comes down for the festival every year. He's developed so many of these routes here. It's just, there's so many people in the community that it's going to be very hard for me to give everyone the credit they deserve.
Sure, but you're saying, some of these original developers are still here.
That's part of it. And then there's this just wave of people that really took up the mantle of it. And I think the foremost person I should mention there is Sam Leitner. Sam certainly spent time here early, with Todd Skinner and crew. But when he moved here, he took up this hardware replacement mantle with just this incredible effort. Like the amount of roots that he rebolted over a few seasons, and certainly with a bunch of the community supporting too, was pretty stunning. So we deserve a lot of credit there. But ultimately, it kind of comes back to this this consolidation of community, and they started this bolt anchor replacement fund really early, long before the ASCA.
The barf.
The barf, yeah. Long
Great
before the
name.
ASCA started supplying them any hardware up here. So it's been pretty amazing. And honestly, the community here, it's not just the folks doing the rebolting and the root development and the stuff directly at the crag. You know, we have such a through line of community. I mean, you look at folks like Amy Skinner. You don't see her out at the crag, you know, drilling and replacing bolts so much, but she's so involved with all these other facets of the community. And our focus here is hardware replacement, but I think the number one credit why we don't deal with controversy here is the fact that we're all respectful of each other. We have a very consolidated community, and we have these figures we really look to for guidance, I think, in our community.
And that's really interesting. That wasn't necessarily the answer I expected, but it makes a lot of sense. And I mean, this is the 30th year of the Climbers Festival?
Yeah,
which is
30th,
incredible.
30th anniversary here.
Yeah,
it's pretty funny
incredible.
because it really started as just like, hey, let's have a party to celebrate the climbing, and they had like one international guest here from like Germany the first year, and that was hence the international name. Yeah. And boy, it's just totally grown. I think a lot of folks don't realize that the Climbers Fest actually supports our local climbing organization here, which is the Central Wyoming Climbers Alliance, aka WYO Climbers. And it's actually our biggest fundraiser of the year. So it all goes right back into that 501c3, and we do a ton of different stuff. You know, it's not just bolt replacement, although over 6,000 bolts have been replaced in the Lander area, a staggering number of bolts.
Wow.
It's trail work, it's signage, it's human waste disposal, it's adaptive management of raptor closure so that we don't have to close mile-long sections of cliff and the birds can still succeed in their fledging.
Can you guys come down to Indian Creek and do that too?
Yeah, that's a complex one, right? And I should, that program deserves a mention because the working with the various land managers, and we have several different land managers we work with. We have state park entities, we have BLM, we have Forest Service here.
That's the one thing, not to cut you off, but we started a Climbers Coalition recently. Like that's square one is like getting a good relationship with the land managers.
100%, and we should, this is something that should absolutely be a primary focus for anyone interested in stewardship work. We're not going to expect the land manager to go out and replace hardware necessarily, but if we can have a good working relationship with them so that they're recognizing climbers as a legitimate use of the resource, and then they have an understanding of what that means and what that takes to do that, is huge. But I think an example of that adaptive management plan for raptors is really a great one, because you have a situation where you have a mile-long section of cliff band that's very popular sport climbing venue, a couple hundred routes. Well, if you just have a standard raptor closure that they don't take a closer look, they just see a nest, that's a mile-long closure. That's a half a mile on either side. And you lose that whole cliff for that season. Meanwhile, we've learned that that's really not necessary at all. It's just a blanket closure. So what we do is we go in and we work with the land manager, and the biologists come out and we decide what routes need to be closed that will have any impact on the birds. And we've been doing this for years. We've had many successful nesting sites, and they return to those nesting sites every year. And we're able to close these short sections of cliff, and people are very respectful about it. The compliance is very high, and we're able to still have this climbing resource during its best season, and then the birds are still able to successfully fledge and come back year after year, which is a pretty amazing thing to see. I mean, that's certainly just as important as us being able to have our climbing access. And the other thing that comes along with good cooperation with land managers, if we just close a mile-long section of cliff, the chance of people not complying with that closure is actually much higher, because it's this massive section, and then they say, oh, well, I'm fine to go over here, or I don't really care, I need to go climbing. And that makes the climbing community look really bad, and it strains our our relationship with that land manager. So whenever we have these collaboration opportunities, we're just far past this time where we could just fly under the radar with climbing. We have a bit of this this sort of rebel history a little bit, and this I'm going to kind of do what I want, and I think that's really cool that still exists to some degree in climbing. But we have to recognize that with the amount of climbers we have nowadays, we have an impact, and that requires stewardship and collaboration with land managers so that we have a legitimate voice and we're not destroying the resource when we have really high volume of people.
Yeah, totally. And I think, when we're off the air, you said that community is a big thing you were looking for of where you decided to live. And Lander, I think, has that really connected, larger climbing community for a town that just has, a certain amount of climbers. But I think that community, you guys have just a great community here, and I think it's an inspiration. I know it is for me when I go back home to Durango. I'm always taking a part of what you all have done here, and it's just always a treat to come up here and be a part of this community for a little while. And every time I come up here, I'm like, I should stay longer next time,
Yeah, for sure. I interact with local climbing organizations around the country, and Lander is absolutely a model on a bunch of different levels. The hardware replacement is the one I look at all the time, the mountain they've been able to get done, and how as a relatively small town we're able to steward this very large resource that sees a lot of visitation. But it's on a bunch of different levels, and there's a lot to learn there for different LCOs across the country, and a lot of LCOs are just forming and just figuring out how to steward their resource. And it's great to have such a fantastic model to reference for people.
Yeah, definitely. It's inspirational and aspirational. So the last few minutes we got here, I want to ask you about, I think one of the biggest changes in sport climbing is the lower off anchors. And for me, everything changed. I feel like there was quite a gray area in there where there's the ethic of preserving the anchor that's up there. So you tie in, you put your own gear, you never top rope off what's up there. And that has completely shifted now. So I want to talk about that initiative from ASCA's perspective, and then, talking about nuance. I think there's a couple nuance points that we could both offer our takes on, and maybe kind of educate someone who is unsure when they come to 2-bomber, Climb Tech Moosey hooks, if you can just clip them and go or not, But I like to hear, because I know that's on your social media, that's something you're really highlighting right now is your lower off campaign, and how many you've been able to hang at these popular areas like 10 Sleep, Rifle, the list goes on and on.
Yeah, that's something that's really taken off over the last few years. And really the lower off initiative is its primary focus is not convenience, even though it is very convenient to have a clip and lower style anchor. The primary focus is reducing accidents. So many of our accidents, one of the most common scenarios for serious injury and fatality at single pitch climbing areas is belayer miscommunication at the anchor. And that means people, miscommunicate whether they're lowering or rappelling, open the system and don't close it again properly. That type of thing. And a lot of those issues are solved with the clip and lower style anchor. Again, there's nuance to this, and it doesn't work everywhere. Pitch length is certainly something to think about. Is this a multi-pitch route? Is there climbing above it? Things like this. But from a basic standpoint of a cragging area where most of the pitches are 30 meters or less, it really makes a ton of sense. And you definitely see a reduction of incidents. You see better traffic flow. So if there's a clip and lower style anchor there, then we call these anchor hooks. Some people call them mussy hooks, but it's the Climb Tech anchor hook is the one we prefer. It's specifically designed for climbing with the stainless steel wire gate. The gates hold up much better than the previous mussy hooks that have been used. Folks have been using those for many years around the country, but we really took off with this pretty aggressively in the last few years because we've just...
I just want to interject with the old school ones could be terrifying. They were like figuring out the system because when they were like the hardware store ones with the terrible gates, you'd come up to some of them where the gates you could like, they're like stay open, and then the Moosey gets the hardware gets worn and sharp. But these Climb Tech ones just seem to be just. I mean, we've had some at the golf wall. We have I think Moosey hooks on every route. Golf wall's like our local beloved limestone choss pile. Like after work, have you been there before?
I haven't been there, but I'm familiar.
You've heard
with
about
it.
it, yeah. It's like it's a cool little place. But we haven't had a single one wear out, and they've been on there for 6 or 7 years.
Yeah, for the high traffic stuff, it's a really good long-term solution. And we actually supply different types of clip and lower anchors for different situations. There is just such a variety in American climbing. For instance, on sea cliffs, even stainless steel is not appropriate.
Right.
And we actually supply titanium glue-in anchors, and titanium ram's horn lower offs.
Yep.
But people were experimenting even many years ago with types of lower offs. Often open cold shots were really popular. And those have worked fine to a degree, but when you have something that's completely open like that, there is a certain risk, and especially if your rope is, you have someone top roping and you have a really pigtailed rope, it can actually pop right out of an open system like that. So I think standardizing this type of equipment in single pitch climbing areas is really, really valuable, especially as the climbing community grows and more people are out making this transition from jib to crag.
I agree, and just another little nuance point there is I see so much confusion, especially in Potrero. And granted, Potrero has the complexity of single pitch and multi-pitch, but I see a lot of confusion, or even in Durango, people will do these complex top rope anchors on these routes with bomber Moosey hooks. And it's like, I just tell everyone, it's like, you can clip those. Like, we're going to wear out before those things do. But I also often see these complex webbing setups, and it's like, I think people think they're helping the resource, but it's like, if those are sitting there and it's good to go. Like, you can put your own hardware on there if you want, but it's totally fine to just clip 2 bomber Moosey hook anchors and just top rope off them or lower off them,
Yeah, and this is a place where there is some nuance too, because different communities will encourage different things.
Sure.
Generally, if you're going to lead the route and just lower off and clean your gear, clip it and lower for sure. If you're going to top rope a large party, I usually do encourage folks to, hang a couple draws on there and just save the wear of the half dozen people that are going to run a lap.
Especially if you're in really high traffic areas, right?
Yeah, or if you have places with sandy soil, like if you ever climbed in the Owens River Gorge, you'll notice hardware really wears out quickly because you get this grit on the ropes that really augers in. So our general guideline for folks is, if you're going to top rope folks, hang a couple draws. One of them can be a locker draw if you want, and then just have the last person just bump up and clip the other ones and grab the gear. It's not too difficult to do, but really, again, we should defer to kind of our local style.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But there is a reason we're using this stuff that's really long lasting and has this really thick stock of steel. It's because we know that things are going to see some significant traffic on them over the years, and we want something that's really going to hold up to that abuse.
Well, that is definitely, I think, just provided, just made sport climbing that much more efficient and enjoyable. Just having those bomber hooks to just clip into.
Totally agree, and I don't think it's something that should be controversial in primarily single pitch areas. Just pay attention to your rope lengths, and the number one thing here, the other main place where people get hurt or people get killed is not closing their system. You shouldn't be putting a knot in the end of your rope just when you happen to notice that maybe the pitch is too long. You should just always have a knot in the end, and then that way, if you find yourself in a scenario, people are going to lower regardless whether or not there's clip and lowers, and the same goes with knotting your ropes to rappel. But close your system, pay attention. Either your belayer should be tied in another end, or there should be a knot in the system. Even if you're out cragging at the Wild Iris, if you have that habit, it's always there, and that one will come back and bite you, sport climbing, if you don't pay attention to it. It's too often and too sad to see it happening all the time.
And one thing I actually noticed in Potrero, that a little critique for us, hardware installers, is that there's, and I'm sure it's in so many areas where there's these crazy rope stretchers where you got to go 10 feet up the rope and the belayer's got to tie a knot in the end. There was a couple routes like that in Potrero, and I'm just like, those routes that you need an 80 meter for in a place that's not the standard, maybe there should be a lower anchor with moosies and not that 80 meter, like you need every bit of an 80 meter to do the route, because in general most people are going down there with a 70.
Yes, absolutely. And what we do is when we provide these clip and lower style anchors, we make sure that folks that are hanging them are thinking about what's considered a standard pitch length. So if a 70 meter is a standard rope that you need to bring to an area, it's acceptable to put a clip and lower on a pitch that needs a 70 to get off. But if it needs an 80 to get off, we should at least provide people another opportunity to stop and think, whether it's seeing if their ends are down and they're rappelling, or they're like, oh, I'm going to hang my gear, what am I going to do to top rope someone, whatever it is. It doesn't obviously prevent people from having that accident, but it's just something that's not nearly common enough for people to close their system. It's just, you can't hammer that one enough.
Yep.
I've spent a lot of time at the City of Rocks, which is a place I love dearly. And one thing that's really unique and special about the city is it has great variety. You can do a run-out horror show that was done ground up with 2 bolts in 90 feet or something and no gear, right next to a line that'll eat up gear, right next to a nice mixed route, right next to a very well-bolted sport route. And we have a bunch of variety in pitch lengths. And sadly, we see deaths there fairly commonly from people lowering off something that's just too long for the rope, because there's so much variety. You have pitches you can get off with a 50, and you have pitches that you need an 80 to get off of. So we really need to pay attention to that as climbers, and that's where you're exposing yourself when you're single pitch climbing. It's really probably not the stuff where you're scared, where you think you're going to take the scary winger. It's actually in these mundane things we do all the time, like rappelling, like belay transitions, like lowering. Have a good plan, communicate well with your belayer. It's very important.
Definitely. Well, thanks for giving us this insight into ASCA and in the world of bolts. I know you kind of have an encyclopedic mind for this stuff, and thanks for this taking the time during the Climbers Festival to just show us how this world works, and we're very grateful for all the work that you all do.
Yeah, we can. I mean, there's so much to get into it. This stuff we could rabbit hole forever. So we should do it again and follow up at some point. I think it would be great to chat about it again. And I'll give a shout out to say, if you spend time climbing around Lander, please support our work, make a donation to the CWCA, or come join us at the festival. And if you like clipping the lower offs, you like seeing good hardware around the country being replaced, old bolts being replaced, safeclimbing.org, this ASCA website. We're a 501c3 nonprofit, and to tax-deductible donations, of course, so we appreciate any support you can send our way, and a huge shout-out to all the volunteers actually getting the work done across the country.
I get asked that question 50 times a year, like, how do I support what you're doing? And I always tell them, go donate to ASCA. So if you're listening and you saw me at the Crag and asked me that, get online and go make a donation to ASCA. Thanks, brother.
Cheers, man. Thanks for having me.
All right, that was my episode with Nate Liles of the American Safe Climbing Association. I really enjoyed listening to that for a second time. It was originally aired a couple years ago. You can find the Climbing Zine at the International Climbing Festival. We'll have a booth at the Art Crawl and the Trade Fair as well. And I'm going to be doing some storytelling for the Houlihan narratives, and then I'll also be reading some spoken word poetry at the keynote presentation in the park there as well. So get ready for some storytelling and some poetry, and we'll also be holding our haiku contest. We bring a typewriter up and have a little haiku contest. Zaz, our shipping manager, will be there as well, and so will I. So that'll be our first event working it together. Usually it's one of us, but we're both going to be rallying up for this one. You can find Dirtbag State of Mind clothes and stickers at shop.climbingzine.com, and you can also subscribe to the Climbing Zine. And I always say the best way to support this podcast is subscribe to the zine, and you'll also be getting some great printed reading material in your mailbox. Music from this episode is by Devin Dabney. Our digital editor and producer is Chad Rich. And signing off from El Salto, Mexico, I'm Luke Mihal. Peace.